Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into the life and work of a figure whose legacy is, well, perhaps the most revered and yet, at the same time, the most misunderstood in modern American history, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
That's absolutely right. When you hear the name, you immediately think of the American Baptist minister,
Yeah.
the civil rights activist who led the movement from 1955 right up until his assassination in 1968.
Right.
But the archive of material we've gathered, I mean, it's a full historical stack covering his intellectual journey, his strategic campaigns, the whole thing. It demands that we strip away the simple iconography. We have to look at the complicated, evolving, and ultimately radical man.
So our mission today, then, is total clarity. We want to guide you beyond the sound bites, beyond the one or two famous quotes everyone knows. We're going to explore the surprising details of his personal history, the strategic development, and really the paradoxical application of nonviolence.
And he's increasingly radical political and economic views in his final years. I mean,
Yeah.
these were views that alienated a lot of his allies.
A huge number of them. And, of course, the absolutely intense state surveillance he faced from J. Edgar Hoover's FBI.
We've synthesized sources that cover everything from, the profound impact of his father's defiance to the philosophical grounding of his resistance, the big legislative triumphs of the mid-60s.
And then that eventual shift, the move to a comprehensive critique of American capitalism and militarism.
Exactly. It's a journey from a pulpit to a political philosopher, and it fundamentally reshapes how you see the man who defined modern American protest.
Okay, so let's start with a foundational yet, an often overlooked fact. He wasn't born Martin Luther King Jr.
Precisely. On January 15th, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, he was born Michael King Jr.
Michael King Jr.
And the change is significant because it wasn't just a nickname or something he adopted. It was mandated by his father, Michael King Sr., who was himself a really prominent minister at the Ebenezer Baptist Church.
And that change, it happened in 1934, right, following an international trip his father took.
Yes. In 1934, Michael King Sr. traveled through Europe. He stopped in Berlin for the 5th Congress of the Baptist World Alliance and was just. He was deeply affected by the sights associated with the 16th century Reformation leader, Martin Luther.
The original Martin Luther.
The original. That boldness, the willingness to stand up against a huge, established power structure, it just resonated so deeply with him.
So he comes home and he makes this monumental decision.
He does. Upon returning in August 1934, Michael Sr. decided to rename both himself and his young son, who was only 5 at the time, Martin Luther King Sr. and Jr.
Wow. And the birth certificate wasn't even formally updated until much later.
Not until 1957, when he was already 28 years old. It tells you immediately that he was raised not just to be a minister, but to carry the weight of this monumental historical legacy of defiance.
And that defiance became necessary almost immediately. I mean, his childhood was defined by these really sharp, repeated encounters with segregation.
They absolutely were. And one of the most shaping incidents happened when he was only 6 years old, just starting school in September 1935.
He had a white playmate across the street, right? But as soon as they started going to segregated schools, that was it.
That was it. The friend's parents forbade the boys from playing together, telling King directly, "We are white and you are colored."
How do you even process that as a 6-year-old?
Well, when he brought this home, his parents didn't sugarcoat the reality of American racism or the history of slavery. But his initial response, it was very human. It was intense. He later wrote that this incident made him determined to hate every white person.
That initial raw anger is so key because it's where his whole philosophical path was laid out.
It is. His parents, who were devout Christians, intervened immediately. They instructed him in this radical Christian idea of love, emphasizing that it was his spiritual duty to love everyone, even those who hated him.
So that tension between a very real, justifiable anger and this disciplined love, that becomes the core of his nonviolent philosophy later on.
And we really can't overlook the profound influence of his father's example. Martin Sr. was constantly modeling resistance.
Yeah, there's that famous story of the police officer who stopped them.
Right. The officer disrespectfully referred to Martin Sr. as boy. And Martin Sr. just points to his son and says, "This is a boy. I am a man," demanding respect right there on the spot.
And the shoe store incident is just as telling.
It is. When the clerk told Martin Sr. and young Martin Jr. they had to move to the back of the store, Martin Sr. stood his ground. He said, "We'll either buy shoes sitting here or we won't buy any shoes at all." And he just walked out.
And he told his son?
He told his son, "I don't care how long I have to live with this system, I will never accept it." This wasn't passive acceptance. It was this instilled, active refusal to cooperate with injustice years before King ever heard the name Gandhi.
But the personal indignity, it just keeps building. It all culminates in that 1944 bus incident. King was 15 years old. He'd just won a public speaking contest.
And on the bus ride home, he and his teacher were ordered by the driver to stand up so that white passengers could sit down.
And they weren't just told to stand.
No, they were forced to stand for miles. And the driver calls King a black son of a bitch. King wanted to resist physically, but his teacher, she realized the danger and urged him to comply because they'd be breaking the law.
And he wrote about this later, didn't he?
He did. He wrote, "That night will never leave my memory. It was the angriest I have ever been in my life." It just underscores that his philosophical nonviolence was a choice. It was a choice made against a very real, personal, burning anger.
So his intellectual journey really followed this same tension. He was raised Baptist, but he began questioning theology pretty early on.
Very early. At age 13 in Sunday school, he openly denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus. He just struggled to find personal satisfaction in religion, noting that doubts began to spring forth unrelentingly. He was looking for something rational, something that could apply to the injustice he was seeing every single day.
And yet he was academically accelerated. He skipped 9th grade, enrolled in Morehouse College at 15 in 1944.
And it was there that the president of Morehouse, Benjamin Mays, became his definitive spiritual mentor. Mays was also a Baptist minister, but he was fiercely committed to social justice. He urged his students to see the ministry not as an escape into dogma, but as an instrument for social protest.
Which is exactly what King needed to hear. It allowed him to reconcile his rational academic side with his spiritual calling.
Exactly. He concluded that the church offered the most assuring way to answer an inner urge to serve humanity. It let him be a rational minister who could use his sermons for social change.
And during his time at Morehouse, he gets this eye-opening glimpse of a different reality during a summer job in Connecticut.
In Simsbury, Connecticut, is his first trip to the North, and he wrote these amazing letters back to his father about the lack of discrimination once he passed Washington, D.C.
He was just amazed, right, that they could go to one of the finest restaurants in Hartford.
And that Negroes and whites go to the same church. I mean, you have to imagine that experience just contrasted so starkly with the rigid caste system of Atlanta. It must have cemented in his mind the real possibility of an integrated society that he would eventually fight for.
So he continues his studies, earns a Bachelor of Divinity from Crozier's Theological Seminary in 1951, where he was elected student body president.
In an integrated setting, which is key. Then he moves to Boston University and gets his PhD in systematic theology in 1955.
And speaking of his academic life, we do have to provide the full context of that 1991 academic inquiry into his doctoral dissertation.
That inquiry is crucial context. It's part of the whole story. It concluded that portions of his dissertation were in fact plagiarized. He had improperly included passages and citations from other sources.
Which raises these complex questions about academic integrity, the pressure on young academics, all of it.
It does. But the key detail here is the university's response. The committee at Boston University ultimately decided against revoking his degree. They stated that despite the issues with attribution, the dissertation still makes an intelligent contribution to scholarship.
So the institutional decision was basically that the ideas were sound, even if the execution reflected some improper scholarly technique.
That's right. It remains this historical footnote that just emphasizes that even these monumental figures are complex and sometimes flawed in ways we might not expect.
Okay, so following his theological studies, King transitions directly into activism. And this Mary's Cafe sit-in in Mapleshade, New Jersey in 1950, while he was still a student, is a vital piece of the puzzle.
It's so important because it was his first real act of resistance. He called it a formative step, and it happened before he consciously adopted any Gandhian principles.
It's an incredible story of spontaneous defiance. He and his friends stop at Mary's Cafe.
They refused service for beer, and then they refused non-alcoholic ginger ales, even though New Jersey had a state anti-discrimination law on the books.
And when they refused to leave, the owner, a man named Ernest Nichols, he escalated things very, very quickly.
He fired a gun into the air. He reportedly shouted, "I'd kill for less."
Whoa.
And this was the moment, I think, King saw the physical violence that was just simmering right under the surface of the system, triggered by nothing more than just refusing to leave a seat.
But they didn't back down?
No, they immediately filed a police report with help from the NAACP, and Nichols was found guilty of disorderly conduct and fined $50. King successfully used the law and nonviolent persistence to hold him accountable.
And critically, as you said, this happened 6 months before he went to a lecture by Mordecai Johnson that detailed the tactics of Mohandas Gandhi.
Exactly. His willingness to just sit there in the face of violence that was already innate.
So the major breakthrough that really launches him onto the national stage, that comes later in Montgomery, Alabama, starting in December 1955. He's a pastor there at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church.
And the catalyst, of course, was Rosa Parks' arrest.
The Montgomery Bus Boycott was strategically planned by local activists like Edgar Nixon, but King was kind of thrust into that leadership role.
He was. And it was a massive, sustained effort. It lasted 385 days. The backlash was severe. His house was bombed. He was arrested multiple times.
And famously for going 30 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone.
Exactly. These constant arrests and the threat of violence drew intense national media attention, and it just rapidly increased his public stature as this effective, eloquent leader of the movement.
And the boycott worked.
It did. It succeeded when the U.S. District Court, in a case called Browder v. Gale, ruled that racial segregation on Montgomery's public buses was unconstitutional. King's successful, nonviolent application of pressure and litigation elevated him instantly. He became the best-known spokesman for civil rights in the country.
This leads directly to the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, in 1957. What was the central organizing genius behind the SCLC?
Well, its genius was leveraging the infrastructure that was already there. The Black Church. The SCLC used the moral authority and organizing power of Black churches all across the South to coordinate these large-scale nonviolent campaigns.
Mass marches, boycotts, civil disobedience?
All of it. It gave the movement a unified, disciplined organizational base that was rooted in Christian ethics.
Okay, now let's dig into the core of his nonviolent philosophy. We know he cited Gandhi's successful precedent and Thoreau's on civil disobedience. But his commitment to it, it wasn't immediate or easy, was it? Especially when it came to his own personal safety.
That's a crucial complexity. The sources confirm that King initially did practice self-defense. He even obtained guns to protect his family after threats, especially during that really volatile Montgomery period.
I mean, he was a man with a family facing lethal danger.
Absolutely. So the personal shift to a total renunciation of arms, that came from the influence of key pacifist advisors. People like Bayard Rustin, who was his first regular advisor, and white pacifists like Glenn Smiley and Harris Wofford.
And what did they show him?
They showed him that nonviolence wasn't just a tactic. It was a comprehensive philosophy rooted in agape unconditional Christian love, and that resorting to arms, even for self-defense, would ultimately undermine the moral superiority of the movement.
And so King eventually vowed to no longer personally use arms.
He did.
But this brings us to a really critical point of historical nuance, one that reveals the high-stakes reality of the struggle in the Deep South. We have King, who is philosophically committed to nonviolence, but the movement itself was often protected by the readiness of local armed allies. This feels like a massive paradox.
It is a profound paradox that historians are still grappling with. While King insisted that demonstrators should remain nonviolent to achieve social and moral change, he was trying to win the opponent over to friendship. He was frequently protected by groups that did not share that total philosophical commitment to pacifism.
So who were these protection groups?
Well, figures like Robert Haling, who led the movement in St. Augustine, Florida. His group was affiliated with King's campaigns, but they explicitly advocated for and practiced armed self-defense right alongside nonviolent tactics.
And there were more famous groups too, right?
Oh yeah, even more famous were groups like the Deacons for Defense and Justice. They were routinely on the perimeter of marches and King's residences, carrying weapons to deter attackers.
Wait, so when King goes into a volatile town, he's relying on nonviolence to win the moral argument and challenge the law.
Right.
But at the same time, he's relying on the implicit threat of violence from groups like the Deacons to prevent an outright massacre. So does this mean King's nonviolence was only successful because it was backed by the deterrent effect of armed allies?
That is the essential, difficult question. For King, nonviolence was the strategic method for social change. He believed violence would just lead to these escalating cycles of destruction. But for local activists who were facing constant immediate threat, survival was the first priority.
So the movement was really a coalition.
Exactly. And King had to accept that his moral purism could only be implemented in the context of pragmatic physical security provided by others. It's the complexity of trying to lead a revolution while you're under attack.
A necessary tension, then. nonviolence as the weapon of the movement, but armed readiness as the perimeter of survival.
That's a great way to put it. And the years 1963 to 1965, they represent the movement's high water mark. They were characterized by these intentionally confrontational campaigns designed not just to protest, but to provoke, to force the federal government to intervene.
And the Birmingham Campaign in 1963 is the definitive example of this.
Absolutely. The strategy, which was designed in part by Wyatt T. Walker, was brutal in its clarity. They knew that the police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, was hot-tempered and that he would react violently.
So the goal was literally to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. They wanted to generate national outrage.
They systematically violated segregation laws, fully expecting mass arrests. And the campaign became internationally infamous because of the controversial decision to involve children and young adults, the Children's Crusade, which was led by SCLC strategist James Bevel.
King himself was a bit uncertain about using children at first, wasn't he?
He was, but the decision was made out of necessity. The adult population risked losing their jobs if they protested. So what happened next was broadcast globally.
Bull Connor unleashed the police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses.
Oh, hoses powerful enough to strip bark from trees. He used them against these demonstrators, including children. The photographs and the television footage of this brutality just shocked many white Americans who had previously seen segregation as this distant, localized issue.
And the resulting moral outcry was immense. It forced the city to begin desegregating.
And while he was jailed during this campaign, his 13th arrest, he penned the letter from Birmingham jail, which is now considered one of the most important historical documents of the 20th century.
He wrote it in the margins of a newspaper, right? Responding to 8 local white clergymen who had published an open letter asking him to stop the protests.
They were urging him to use legal channels, arguing that the demonstrations were untimely and provocative.
He argued so powerfully that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. But what's often forgotten is the real target of his fiercest intellectual fire. It wasn't Bull Connor.
No, it was the white moderate. He expressed this profound regret that the Negro's great stumbling block is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice.
He laid out this deep philosophical difference between negative peace and positive peace.
Yes, the moderate preferred negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Essentially, they were more concerned with civility and quiet streets than with actual equality, constantly telling the Negro to wait for a more convenient season.
So the triumph in Birmingham really sets the stage for the massive march on Washington for jobs and freedom on August 28, 1963.
It does. King was one of the Big Six leaders coordinating the event.
And it's fascinating how much political tension was swirling around this demonstration. President Kennedy was initially opposed to the march.
He was. He feared it would derail his attempts to pass civil rights legislation and was worried about potential violence. So the organizers, including King, they had to acquiesce to significant pressure from the White House.
They agreed to a less confrontational program than some of the activists wanted.
Exactly. The event was designed to focus more on racial harmony and constitutional principles rather than on, radical demands.
But despite the constraints, the sheer scale of it was undeniable. It drew over 250,000 people, and it all culminated in King delivering his 17-minute I Have a Dream speech.
And what stands out about that speech is that the most famous part, the dream part, was an improvisation.
No.
Yeah. He was following his prepared text until the gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson, who was behind him, shouted, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream."
Wow. So he just abandons the script.
Completely. And delivered the lines that define the era. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character."
And the impact was immediate. The march, and that speech specifically, galvanized public support.
It put civil rights squarely at the top of the national agenda, and it facilitated the ultimate passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in employment and public accommodations.
That legislative momentum then continued right into 1965 with the Selma voting rights movement, which was a joint effort with the SNCC focused on voter registration.
And the pivotal event there was Bloody Sunday. When the first march started, state police and others just violently attacked the peaceful marchers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
He wasn't actually present for that first attempt, a fact that got him some criticism.
Right, but the television footage of the brutality was just devastatingly effective. It became a national turning point in the effort to gain public support.
And so King led the third successful march, which concluded on March 25, 1965, on the steps of the state capitol.
And there he delivered the "How long, not long" speech, using that now famous phrase from the abolitionist Theodore Parker. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice."
And that sustained pressure, built through televised nonviolent suffering, led directly to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Which abolished literacy tests and provided federal oversight of voter registration, securing the right to vote for millions of African Americans.
Okay, this is where we pivot into the deep dive territory that I think a lot of people miss. After the legislative triumphs of 64 and 65, the legal battles were, for the most part, one King's focus shifted dramatically.
It really did. It moved from issues of legal rights in the South to these much broader structural issues of economic and global policy across the entire nation. And this shift was marked by a profound sense of disillusionment.
Because the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, they didn't fix poverty.
Exactly. They didn't fix the systemic poverty, the joblessness, the housing discrimination facing African Americans, especially in the urban North. The Watts riots in 1965 were this brutal wake-up call that achieving legal equality did not equal economic justice.
So King realized he'd been fighting for integration into a system that was itself fundamentally flawed and oppressive to the poor of all races.
That's right. And this philosophical evolution really crystallized with his vocal opposition to the Vietnam War, starting around 1967. This was a massive political risk.
It was career-threatening. For years, King had avoided public criticism of the war to protect his civil rights agenda. He was afraid it would alienate President Johnson, who was essential for passing domestic legislation.
But he was urged by key SCLC activists like James Bevel, and King finally decided he just could not remain silent any longer.
Which resulted in his landmark Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence speech in April 1967. And this was an intellectual break with the mainstream Democratic establishment and his white liberal allies.
He connected the war directly to economic injustice. He stated that he could no longer urge poor black men to fight for freedoms abroad that they didn't even possess at home. But the critique went deeper than just hypocrisy.
He said the U.S. was in Vietnam to occupy it as an American colony.
Yes, and he called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today.
I mean, that is not the language of a moderate civil rights leader. That is the language of a revolutionary critic of foreign policy.
And he linked the war machine to a spiritual and economic failure at home. He argued, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death.
He called for a true revolution of values, stating that true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. He was demanding America shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society.
And the political backlash was instant, it was visceral, and it was powerful. President Johnson, who had once been his ally, permanently broke ties with him.
Powerful union leaders pulled their financial support. Major publications turned on him.
Life magazine, which was this massive influential publication, accused him of demagogic slander that sounded like a script for Radio Hanoi. They declared King had diminished his usefulness to his cause. The price for that speech was his mainstream political legitimacy.
And that anti-war stance, it was really just a symptom of a broader, even more radical critique of the American economic model.
Absolutely. King maintained a public policy of non-alignment with political parties because he believed a leader must remain in the position of non-alignment to be the conscience of both. But his economic philosophy was clearly far to the left of center.
He rejected both laissez-faire capitalism and communism.
He did. He saw communism as totalitarian, denying individual rights and spiritual freedom, but he saw capitalism as equally destructive because of its inherent exploitation and materialism.
There's a private letter he wrote to Coretta Scott in 1952, before he was famous, where he was just explicit about it.
He wrote, I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. And he later publicly stated that capitalism has outlived its usefulness and that America must move toward a democratic socialism.
And we need to be clear about what he meant by democratic socialism. He wasn't talking about the Soviet model.
Not at all. He wasn't advocating for state ownership of all industry. He meant a massive democratic restructuring of the economy centered on human need rather than profit maximization. He saw the existing system as rigged.
He argued that in America, the problem is that we all too often have socialism for the rich and rugged, free enterprise capitalism for the poor.
Exactly. This led him to his final intellectual framework, what he called the giant triplets of evil.
Racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism.
He believed they were all inextricably linked, arguing that reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced.
So if you look at this, you realize he evolved from being a reformer, seeking integration, into being a systemic revolutionary, seeking a fundamental overhaul of the entire economic structure.
And that understanding directly explains his final major organizing push, the Poor People's Campaign in 1968.
So what were the specific demands of this campaign, which he was working on when he was killed?
The goal was to organize a multiracial army of the poor, Black, white, Latino, and Native American, to march on and essentially occupy Washington, D.C. They planned to use massive, nonviolent civil disobedience until Congress agreed to an economic Bill of Rights.
And this bill wasn't vague at all. It included really concrete demands.
Very concrete. Guaranteed employment for all, a guaranteed annual income, creation of massive housing programs, and the investment of poverty funds comparable to the alacrity and generosity with which Congress was funding the military.
He was just deeply frustrated by Congress's attitude, which he described as showing hostility to the poor.
He said they spent military funds with alacrity and generosity while only providing poverty funds with miserliness.
But this campaign was incredibly controversial, even within the civil rights movement establishment itself.
It was. King was pushing his organization far beyond what his moderate allies were comfortable with. His former key advisor, Bayard Rustin, actually resigned from the planning committee.
Why?
He felt the goals were too broad, logistically unrealizable, and crucially, that this level of confrontation would invite an accelerated repression and violence that the movement just could not survive. The Poor People's Campaign was a real sign of King's increasing isolation and radicalism in his last year.
You know, this whole discussion of his economic vision, it gives us the necessary context for the reparations idea that often gets brought up in his name. He had very specific proposals for large-scale compensation.
He did. We had this noted as a closing thought, but let's integrate the context right now. In a 1965 interview, King proposed a government compensatory program of $50 billion over 10 years.
And it was for all disadvantaged groups, right? Not just African Americans.
That's a key point. It was for poor whites, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, everyone who was disadvantaged. He called it a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged.
He wasn't advocating for a full restitution of wages lost to slavery, which he called impossible, but for a compensatory economic floor, a massive societal investment.
And he justified the price tag by saying that this investment would be more than amply justified by the benefits that would accrue to the nation through a spectacular decline in school dropouts, family breakups, crime rates, all these social evils. This economic blueprint was absolutely foundational to his final year of organizing.
Okay, so if the last section revealed the radical nature of King's political evolution, this next part has to confront the brutal, unprecedented response of the American state to that radicalism. We have to talk about J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI.
Hoover viewed King as an existential threat to the American status quo. He personally ordered intense surveillance. The FBI initially labeled King a radical, but they escalated their assessment dramatically after the success of the I Have a Dream speech.
They deemed him the most dangerous and effective Negro leader in the country.
And the Senate Church Committee later confirmed that from December 1963 until his death in 1968, King was the sole target of an intensive FBI counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, with the explicit stated goal to neutralize him.
So how did this all start?
Well, it began with limited authorization from Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy in 1963. And this authorization was primarily due to King's association with Stanley Levison, who was a New York lawyer and fundraiser who had had some former Communist Party ties back in the 1940s and 50s.
And why was Stanley Levison such a threat to the FBI, even though he had long since severed those ties?
We have to remember, this was the height of the Cold War. It was peak anti-communist paranoia. For Hoover, any association with a former communist was justification for labeling the SCLC a subversive organization, especially if that organization threatened the racial order of the South.
And RFK was worried about the politics of it.
He was. He worried that if Levison's past was exposed, it would give Southern congressmen ammunition to kill pending civil rights legislation. So he authorized limited wiretapping to confirm if Levison was actually influencing King on policy.
But Hoover immediately extended that clearance far beyond its initial mandate.
Oh, way beyond. He started bugging King's phones and hotel rooms all across the country, looking for any information, political, financial, or personal, that could be used to destroy him.
And the methods of COINTELPRO were shockingly aggressive.
They didn't just listen, they actively tried to disrupt. This included planting informants within the SCLC, trying to derail their funding with anonymous letters to donors, spreading rumors to break up meetings and sow internal discord.
And despite this massive coordinated effort focused on finding communist ties,
The FBI acknowledged by 1976 that they had obtained absolutely no evidence that King or the SCLC were connected to communist organizations.
King, he recognized how absurd the claims were. He often mocked them.
He did. He said in a 1965 interview that there were, quote, as many communists in this freedom movement as there are Eskimos in Florida. He understood that Hoover wasn't interested in national security. He was appeasing racist elements and the far right.
But the surveillance evolved into something much darker. It became outright psychological warfare.
And the most egregious act of coercion was the infamous anonymous letter mailed by the FBI in late 1964. It was accompanied by a tape recording compiled from the hotel bugs alleging extramarital affairs.
This letter was one of the most disgusting acts of state harassment in American history. It detailed his alleged private life.
And it explicitly threatened to expose him to the nation and the church establishment. It gave him a time limit of 34 days, and it concluded with this terrifying ultimatum. You are done. There's but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, fraudulent self is bared to the nation.
It's chilling to realize the FBI actively tried to drive one of America's greatest moral voices to suicide. I mean, how did he continue to operate under that level of stress, knowing the state itself was trying to destroy his mind and his reputation?
We can only speculate on the immense psychological toll. He interpreted the letter correctly, as a direct attempt by the federal government to drive him to self-harm. Yet King continued his work, though he was privately anguished.
The fact that he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize right after receiving this letter just speaks volumes about his focus on the mission.
He really does.
And the FBI's attempts to discredit King through his private life continue to complicate his legacy today. This brings us to the sealed records. The audio tapes and transcripts from the FBI's surveillance are sealed by court order until 2027.
And this sealing means that definitive historical conclusions are just impossible for now. Scholars need to see this material not just to confirm or deny allegations about King's private conduct, but to understand the full extent of the FBI's operational success, the specifics of their targets, and whether government complicity went beyond Hoover's department.
So the sealed files are less about tabloid gossip and more about revealing the full scale of the state's war on its own citizens.
Exactly. And the surveillance net was far wider than just the FBI. The NSA ran a secret operation codenamed Minaret that monitored the communications of prominent Americans, including King, specifically because of his opposition to the Vietnam War.
And local police were involved, too.
Absolutely. We know undercover officers from police departments in Birmingham and Philadelphia monitored the March on Washington. In Memphis, where King was assassinated, the fire station directly across from the Lorraine Motel housed police officers who were keeping him under surveillance.
So the ubiquity of this surveillance, federal, local intelligence agencies, it inevitably fueled the later conspiracy theories, leading to the highly specific and very complex circumstances surrounding his death.
King's final days were the ultimate culmination of his shift toward economic justice. He was in Memphis, Tennessee, in April 1968, supporting the city's black sanitation workers' strike.
And this strike epitomized the systemic inequality he was fighting. Black sanitation workers were paid significantly less than their white counterparts and were often sent home without pay during bad weather, while white workers were paid for a full day.
The strike was simple. They demanded equal pay and union recognition.
On April 3, 1968, after a bomb threat against his plane, King addressed a rally and delivered his final address, the "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech. It's become famous for its prophetic nature.
He spoke about the threats against his life, saying, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop.
And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land.
The next day, April 4, 1968, he was fatally shot at 6:01 p.m. as he stood on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He died an hour later at just 39 years old.
And the autopsy revealed the severe toll the stress had taken, noting that King had the heart of a 60-year-old.
His death triggered immediate massive consequences. Race riots erupted in over 100 U.S. cities. Washington, D.C., Chicago, Baltimore. Cities burned in the wake of the loss of their greatest moral voice.
But there was also an immediate positive legislative impact.
There was. The Memphis sanitation strike was quickly settled on favorable terms, and Congress, shocked and motivated by the tragedy, rushed to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which included the Fair Housing Act, seen as a tribute to King's final struggles against residential discrimination.
So this brings us to the persistent, vexing question of conspiracy. James Earl Ray was arrested and later convicted after pleading guilty to avoid the death penalty, but he quickly recanted.
He did. He claimed he was set up and that a man named Rowell was involved in a conspiracy.
And Ray's claims were, surprisingly, supported by the victim's own family.
That's right. King's son, Dexter Scott King, publicly supported Ray's request for a new trial in 1997, and the family took the matter even further.
In 1999, Coretta Scott King and the children won a civil wrongful death claim against Lloyd Jowers, a Memphis cafe owner who claimed he had been paid $100,000 to arrange the murder.
And the jury in that civil case explicitly found that government agencies were party to the assassination.
This creates a fascinating conflict of truth. You have a civil jury finding conspiracy involving government agencies supported by the family.
But then in 2000, the U.S. Department of Justice concluded its own investigation, finding no credible evidence of conspiracy. They maintained that James Earl Ray was the lone killer and that Jowers' story was fabricated for financial gain.
So we're left with these completely conflicting conclusions. A lone assassin according to the federal government, a government conspiracy according to the King family, and a civil jury.
And regardless of the truth surrounding his death, King's legacy is monumental. The King Center, established by Coretta Scott King in Atlanta, remains dedicated to preserving his work and teaching nonviolent conflict resolution globally.
And his national recognition has only grown. Martin Luther King Jr. Day was established as a federal holiday, first observed in 1986, and officially observed in all 50 states by 2000.
He's also honored liturgically as a martyr in major Christian denominations.
I always appreciate that pop culture anecdote that brings his vision to life. His interaction with Nichelle Nichols, who played Latimer Uhura on Star Trek.
It's a great story. Nichols was considering leaving the show in 1967, and King personally intervened. He told her, "You are our image of where we're going. You don't have a black role. You have an equal role." That vision of equality projected 3 centuries into the future was just immensely powerful for him.
And finally, his place is now permanently etched onto the national consciousness, confirmed by the U.S. Treasury's decision that the reverse of the redesigned $5 bill will feature images from his I Have a Dream speech,
placing him physically on American currency.
So this deep dive really shows you that the celebrated figure we know today was, in reality, far more complex, vulnerable, and ultimately far more radical than the moderate icon he is often painted as.
Absolutely. Let's just consolidate the core insights we've uncovered today.
First, we tracked the crucial evolution of his thought, that necessary move from focusing on legal, conventional desegregation in the early 60s.
To becoming a profound, systemic critic of American materialism and capitalism in his final years, advocating for a massive societal reconstruction and a shift toward democratic socialism.
Second, we examined that dual nature of nonviolence. While it was King's strict personal and philosophical commitment leading him to personally renounce arms,
that commitment frequently operated within the high-stakes reality of the Deep South, often relying upon the armed protection provided by allies like the Deacons for Defense. That paradox underscores the real dangers of the struggle.
And finally, there's that raw tension between his public icon status and the reality of aggressive state coercion. That extensive COINTELPRO campaign, ordered by Hoover and designed explicitly to destroy King.
It proves that the federal government saw him not just as a civil rights leader, but as a genuine revolutionary force that needed to be neutralized at any cost.
And all of this context, especially his final critique of the giant triplets of racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism, it provides essential perspective for today's discussions about systemic inequality. It reminds us that King died a poverty activist.
Right.
And for a final thought for you to explore, go back to that $50 billion compensatory program King proposed. He saw it as a necessary investment, arguing the money would be justified by the benefits that would accrue to the nation through a spectacular decline in social evils.
So reflect on this. King's final mission was to guarantee jobs and income for all people. If the American economy were to adopt King's final radical economic blueprint, a comprehensive economic Bill of Rights, How would that restructuring change the systemic challenges facing the 21st century?
And would it lead to the spiritual and social uplift he so desperately sought?
That is the unfinished work his legacy demands we consider.